Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us. I'm delighted to be hosting another Heifer International live chat today with my guest, livestock sustainable expert, Dr. Jude Capper. Jude, thank you for joining me. And before we get started, as we discussed prior to this, you would explain a little bit of the carbon cycle so that we all begin with the same level of understanding and assumptions, okay? So It's up to you. Go for it.
Will do. And thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to talk this afternoon. Yeah, I think we have some huge misconceptions and misperceptions out there. And the carbon cycle and also the nitrogen cycle, the water cycle, all of these are interrelated because there's somehow a perception out there that what we do in agriculture, in fact, everything that we do in our lives doesn't originate with nature, and of course it all does. And it's easier to explain the carbon cycle with slides and pictures, but I'll do my very best just to talk through it. But ultimately, all of the food that we eat comes from the soil or the water in terms of fish. But if we're just talking about livestock here, it all comes from the soil. So our foundation for healthy food, healthy livestock, healthy crops, healthy plants comes from having a healthy soil. So that's the foundation of everything that we eat as humans. And so carbon continually cycles from the atmosphere into plants or grasses in pasture. Some of that's taken into the soil. Some of the carbon in the plants is obviously eaten by animals, recycled into milk or meat or eggs, and then eaten by people. And then we do have an issue sometimes where the carbon that's eaten by livestock, primarily ruminants, goes into the atmosphere either as carbon dioxide from breathing, which is again a completely natural part of the cycle, or methane emissions, which have a higher global warming potential, i.e. the potential to cause climate change. And I can come onto that into a little bit more detail later on. But I think it's really important to understand that carbon is part of that cycle, that we don't have a big sort of store of carbon somewhere that we're going to use up, as it were, and that we've got to think about that balance when we talk about our food, when we talk about our farming systems, and take into account how the carbon cycles through that system.
Yeah, I was telling you that I was involved in some meetings where they compared the cows to the truck. Of course, a truck gets its carbon right from oil and coal and everything else. And so there is a one linear system from underground all the way into the atmosphere, which is totally different from what you've just explained, which is a cycle, right? Yeah. All the carbon that's emitted either through methane or breathing actually gets recaptured at some point by plants, right? So you could make the argument, I don't know if it's an exaggerated argument, that livestock essentially does not add any carbon at all to the atmosphere on a net basis.
On a net basis, yeah. And we've got some new metrics now as well. So carbon dioxide, obviously, as I say, cycles through. So from the atmosphere into the plants, the soil, back into the cow, back into the atmosphere, round and round and round and round. And until relatively recently, the main sort of culprit from livestock, particularly ruminant livestock, was thought to be methane, because on our current methods of measuring this is about 28 times more potent as a agent of climate change or a global warming potential than carbon dioxide. But some eminent scientists at Oxford University have recently showed that actually, in contrast to carbon dioxide and nitrous oxide, which do accumulate in the atmosphere in that sort of linear type fashion, methane breaks down over about 20 years. So absolutely. So when we have livestock on the planet, they do contribute to climate change, but that impact of methane breaks down over time. And actually, if we have improved productivity, if we have productive livestock, there is some evidence that our livestock actually contribute to cooling the planet, just contributing to the negative impacts of climate change.
That for us people who are involved in livestock all over the world, that comment is a very strong and positive comment about using livestock for the purposes we'll talk about. I was involved in a conversation with some livestock folks at the University of Minnesota, and that particular professor said, if you take a 200 or 300 year kind of perspective on livestock or ruminant presence on Earth, there used to be a whole lot more ruminants on Earth than now.
Absolutely.
Right? So in a way, unfortunately, the reduction in bison and antelopes and everything else, but nonetheless, livestock, as you just said, the current livestock herds are actually smaller than they were before, much more efficient, et cetera, et cetera. So I think the argument that livestock somehow contributes to global warming is a shibboleth. It's just not true. Yeah.
Well, absolutely. And I mean, I am such a data nerd. I mean, I'm a massive data nerd. But I actually did a calculation back when I was at Cornell University doing my postdoc. And I looked at the carbon footprint of all the buffalo that were present in the States up until the mass extinction of about 1860 or so. And those buffalo, simply based on their diets and their methane emissions, had a carbon footprint approximately twice that of the US dairy industry in 2007. And yet we seem to forget, particularly in the media, we seem to sort of differentiate between farmed livestock and so-called sort of natural livestock, as if the methane from farmed livestock is somehow different or more damaging. And, in the atmosphere doesn't care whether that methane came from a termite or a rice field or a smallholder farmer or an intensive farmer. Methane is just methane. So you're absolutely right. We can't sort of differentiate and say cows are bad, but buffaloes are good, or rice fields are absolutely fine, but goats are bad.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. And I think the lesson I've been using now in terms of my communication is about the carbon cycle, because people do think in terms of this kind of unit, a cow by itself, a truck by itself, and it's just the wrong analysis. Okay, so I've beaten that to death. I just, I'm just appalled by the lack of scientific understanding in all of this. Anyway, I know that you've done some research for heifer, and I am not really aware of the results of the work or the kind of observations and conclusions you've come. Would you like to share that with us? That'd be great.
Yeah, absolutely. Totally. So I was charged with looking at the literature and to try and debunk this myth that livestock farmers, and particularly smallholder farmers, are bad for the environment, and to try and get some perspective and some better data into that argument, while always remembering that we have to be science-led. We have to have an evidence basis for everything we talk about, and we've got to be proactive. And as a global agricultural industry, we tend to be reactive rather than proactive quite often. But there's certainly an awful lot of evidence that smallholder farmers get really bashed for having relatively high carbon footprints, for example, per kilo of meat or per kilo of milk. And under present methods of analysis, those carbon footprints, as they're quantified, aren't wrong per se. 2 + 2 still equals 4, but many of the assumptions behind them aren't true. So, for example, many of the methodologies that we use are either based on intensive farms. So we're looking at a Hummer, for example, and imagining that every car on this earth is a Hummer and performs like a Hummer, which of course it doesn't. They are based on methodologies that can be done with an awful lot of data, which is very specific, which gives us a far more detailed answer, but often that data simply isn't available in many areas, many regions. And an awful lot of the work that's referred to, or the numbers that people refer to, are based on a global average. And of course, there is no global average anything. There's no global average height, there's no global average wage, there's no global average cow. So the performance of a native breed cow in a smallholder Kenya, for example, is very, very different to a huge Holstein cow in a 10,000 cow operation in the States. But those differences aren't often understood, they aren't looked at, they aren't examined. So we see messages in the media to say we should eat less meat, we should drink less milk, we shouldn't have livestock. And I think the other biggest thing is that we tend to focus on carbon, and that's entirely understandable, obviously. I mean, we have COP26 going on in the UK in just about 2 weeks' time now. Global warming is a huge issue for the entire world, but we can't simply look at carbon as the only environmental metric. You know, we have to look at biodiversity, we have to look at water use, we have to look at land use, and more importantly, we have to look at all the benefits that livestock give us in terms of the social benefits, income, health, nutrition, social status, female independence, education, all of the things, rather than just going from a carbon footprint point of view, you know, big ag good, smallholder bad, for example. So we've got to take that wider perspective when we look at this issue and not just focus on carbon.
Yeah, and that's an very interesting point in terms of the holistic view about livestock and meat and animal protein, I guess. And so in terms of, you know, one thing we've really promoted in the work that we do with smallholder farmers or smallholder families, really, in terms of bringing in livestock, is the nutritional aspect. Would you like to comment on that?
Yeah, absolutely. Because despite all the work that's been done, we still know that on a global basis, there are an awful lot of infants and children under the age of 3 years or so who don't get their recommended milk, meat and eggs per day. And when those children do get those foods, they do far better in terms of growth, in terms of development, both in terms of their mental development, but also their motor skills. They grow better, they're healthier, they're better able to concentrate at school. And that's a really powerful message, but it does often get hijacked by the sort of lobbyists for livestock about everybody should eat less. Now, on a global basis, there's no doubt that in some countries where we have higher incomes, far better access to food, we probably could eat a little bit less animal protein per person. But that doesn't take into account the huge numbers of people who certainly don't have the right amount of milk, meat and eggs to fulfill their daily requirements.
Mm. Yeah, you know, I remember we're working on, we're in conversation right now on a project regarding cassava. And this is a particular area in northern Zambia. And that particular population does not have much access to animal protein, whether it be dairy or anything else. And so they survive on cassava, which is nutritionally, you know, empty really. And of course, the prevalence of malnutrition and stunting and is very, very high. You know, and we look at this thing and we get the data back and we get the pictures back and we said, why can't people understand this? That you know, a complex diet, or a more complete diet, I should say, is really vital, huh?
Absolutely.
And there's lots of studies now that have been done on the impact of good nutrition. But so just to move to a more proactive stance as opposed to a diagnostic stance. What do you think? I mean, we're talking about the facts here, and you said you're a data nerd, and so are we. What do you think we should say or do to combat or to just counter a lot of these false premises? You know, how do we do that? Because, you know, we're a small player really in the industry when you think about, you know, the beef industry in the United States and South America, et cetera. What do you think is the sharp end of the spear here in terms of the communication? Yeah.
It is difficult because this is a really complex topic. Some of the bits in the report that I've done, Pepper, are so complex, just to make them layperson accessible becomes really difficult. But I think the most important above all else is to share our values. Talk about is so important. As a person who works with people across the world, as a person who's seen the challenges and the opportunities that smallholder farmers face, as a person who understands why this is so important, this is why I want to tell you these things, and then back it up with that data, because we do know from a social science point of view that if we just jump in with the data and say, I think you'll find that the carbon footprint is 1.35789, everybody's gone, everybody's lost. And to be fair to them, the activist groups are very good at saying, this is why you should care, this is why this is important, this is why we should care about whatever the issue is. And we've got to bring that back to people. This is why this is so urgent as an issue, and then bring in the science, bring in the numbers, try to sort of talk about the issues and get to the other person's perspective as well. If we're talking about somebody who's passionate about nutrition or land equity or deforestation or carbon sequestration, greenhouse gas emissions, whatever it might be, tailor our messages appropriately for that audience, because there is so much information, there's so much data, but we exist in a society where we see headlines or bullet points or very short clips, and that's what we take on board. I've heard it said that if you want things on YouTube now, they literally have to be about 90 seconds long, otherwise it's too long. And I go, but we used to watch things that were 2 hours long and 3 hours long and 5 hours long, but people don't have the time to read behind the numbers to understand more. So we need those bite-sized, consistent, science-led messages that are out there in a way that people can understand, and that's quite tricky to do with some of the more complex messages that we've got.
Yeah, it's very interesting. And one of the issues, and one in which we're confronted quite often, is had to do with animal welfare.
Yeah.
Right. And obviously, with smallholder farmers, we don't deal with industrial systems at all, whether it be chicken, cattle, dairy, goats, etc. But the animals, at least in certain parts of the animal protein world, are killed. There's no doubt about it. And that's an issue that's always. It doesn't bother me. I'm very comfortable with animal being processed. I mean, that's just the way life is. But how do you discuss that in a way that's respectful of people who really don't like animals being killed?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's the interesting thing, isn't it? Because I've had an awful lot of arguments, frankly, on
I bet you do.
For example, with the people who are opposed to animal agriculture. And that's absolutely their choice. And they'll talk about environment, or they'll talk about welfare, or they'll talk about health. And they will say, for example, livestock are bad because of climate change, land use, etc. And I'll say, well, here's some data and some more data and some more data to show that this isn't true. And they say, yes, but what about the animal welfare? And I say, but if all the animals are well cared for, if they have a good life up until the point of death, which is, I think, the best thing that we can do in terms of nutrition, management, housing, pasture, etc. And they say, yeah, but. Now, if the issue is, I don't like animals being killed for food, I have no issue with that, no argument against that. That's an absolutely fair value to hold. And my niece, she's just turned 13. She became vegetarian about a year ago, I would say now, simply based on, I don't like the idea of animals being killed. And I'm like, that's absolutely fine. I have no arguments with that in any way, shape or form. What I get frustrated with are the sort of straw man arguments based on, well, the environment, well, the welfare, well, the health, well, the A, B, C, and D.
Yeah, okay.
To cover that up. So I think it's absolutely essential that we are entirely respectful of everybody's beliefs, while, when appropriate and where appropriate, debunking things which we know are false. And unfortunately, as science-led people, we always cite our sources, base it on evidence, give people data, based on Jones et al. 2021 published here. The activists organizations, meat is bad. And that's it. And there's no citation, there's no data, there's no evidence. And we've got to have that evidence basis. And I think the other thing is to put things into context for people. You know, what is the relative carbon footprint of driving for 10 miles versus flying to another country versus eating 10 kilos of beef? You know, what are those choices? Because generally speaking, they aren't as bad as we would assume for milk, meat and eggs consumption, and they are actually far worse in terms of fossil fuel consumption. So flying, having a petrol car, example, have a far higher impact than eating milk, meat and eggs generally do.
Yeah, no, that's interesting. And I think I'm hearing a very good message here, which is you just meet people where they are, right? And if they really object to the killing of animals, then there's nothing much you can say except, okay, accept it. And I, you know, when I was in college, actually, I was a vegetarian, and it wasn't based on that. It was, I think, I just didn't have any money to buy meat.
Well, funny you should say that. When I was 15, I was vegan, and this was before sort of Facebook, Snapchat, Instagram, etc. And I think I just did it to irritate my parents because it made life very difficult. Back in 1990 something, there weren't all the vegan foods available in the higher income countries that there are now, because you couldn't buy a tofu sandwich as you can now, like all over the place. So I think it just made life really difficult for my parents because I was that kind of teenager.
For me, it was purely money. I remember we just basically followed a microbiome diet, you know, which is based on whole brown rice, and it was very cheap, very affordable. So, and you know, I did fine. I did fine physically. I did eat eggs, though. I must say, I did eat eggs. That was cheap food. Anyway, so the whole and the work that you did with smallholder farmers for heifer, as well as the impact that livestock can have on the soil. You began this whole conversation about the soil, and we're soil heads as well. I mean, really believe in soil, and that may be worth discussing for the audience a little bit about the sort of ecological cycle between animal, soil, you know, fertility, etc. So, and water retention, blah blah, etc.
Absolutely. So if we have well-managed livestock on soil, we can improve, as you say, water retention. I know Heifer's done some really interesting work with alpaca in some of the mountain regions.
Yeah, that's right.
Precisely that. Obviously, the waste from the livestock improves both the soil carbon and the nitrogen. We have massive integration of ecosystems in terms of the birds, the insects, the earthworms, and the other wildlife species that can live within that. And of course, we have huge opportunities in terms of carbon sequestration, and there's really interesting work out there to show that sequestration, i.e. taking carbon out of the atmosphere and putting it into soil, can be really improved by good management, and that it's often much higher in regions that are very dense in terms of smallholder farms compared to other regions. So that's a real opportunity in terms of cutting greenhouse gas emissions and global warming. But at the moment, we don't often have the data to measure it. So we know that it's happening from a science point of view. We understand the mechanisms and the potential for it, but we really need better ways to measure it, better ways to be able to say that on this, dairy herd in Kenya, let's say 3 cows, well managed, and the carbon in the soil has increased by 5%, 10%, 20% over time. And that's where I think regenerative agriculture can also play a part, simply in acknowledging that cycle in terms of cutting the amounts of inorganic inputs, so inorganic fertilizers, for example, and working with the soil to improve it, and so therefore improve the pastures, improve the crops, and improve the way that the livestock perform as well.
This whole issue of measurement has been bothering me forever, because I think I was pretty much well informed about soil quality and all of the or the content of soil. And I've been very frustrated how expensive it is to actually measure the content of soil, whether it be water or carbon or life or everything else. Do you see progress being made in terms of having very affordable, rapid testing of soil?
I would hope that we can, but from my work in the UK, I know that it's still very expensive over here as well, which does imply that it's not going to be easy and affordable anytime soon. We can do soil or organic matters relatively cheaply, because then we're just drying the soil basically in an oven, weighing it at the start, weighing it at the end. And there are some research farms here in the UK who are doing some really exciting stuff in terms of water holding, water flows, nitrogen flows through livestock farms, but it does take huge investment. And then the question is, how do we take those learnings from farms and get them out to the wider industry? And I mean, we have an issue doing that here in a relatively well-developed country, so it's even more difficult when people don't have access to the infrastructure to go to meetings, to have the internet access to research, etc. So yeah, it's a
huge... because we're constantly approached by donors to say, well, there's a carbon market out there. If you can show that you're sequestering so much carbon, the farmers can get paid for doing that. Well, I say, okay, but it's not so easy to measure. We have a ranch, as you probably know, in Arkansas, the Heifer Ranch, and we're a savory hub, and of course the savory system is quite data driven, and but the expense of actually measuring in a statistically valid way is high, and we can afford it. I mean, that's what we do, but wow, it's when you think about a smallholder farmer, the guy who's got an acre or a couple of hectares, he or she will never be able to afford it. And yet, when you're talking about 300 or 400 million farmers, if they were doing it systematically and we could measure it in some kind of sampling rate, they sequester enormous amount of carbon, right? So it's an interesting quandary. And I've talked to people about it and trying to encourage them to find spectroscopy or some kind of new technology to try and measure this quick. It doesn't have to be 100% accurate, right? I mean, I think.
No, absolutely.
Yeah. So.
And I mean, I think that data collection is probably our biggest issue across the world. Data on greenhouse gas emissions from a native cow compared to a Holstein cow, data on different feeds, data on soil carbon, data on health and welfare. I've just been doing a different project with a different organization looking at the incidence of endemic diseases across the globe. So things like anthrax, brucellosis, foot and mouth. And again, getting the data even on the prevalence of those is really, really tricky. And then on the impacts of those diseases in terms of animal health, productivity, milk yield, growth rate, etc., is really, really tough. And if we just had better data across the world, we could do so much to have sort of proxies and trends and say, well, if we know that in this area, carbon sequestration happens at a rate of, 30% under these conditions, then farmers could use that proxy and say, under this protocol, I'm doing these 10 things. There is no reason to think that my soil isn't at peak carbon. But again, we just don't have the data at the moment, which is a real loss.
Yeah, we're going to close pretty quickly, but I was just one thought about the primarily dairy cows, but also beef and everything else. The feeding of these animals can be quite difficult, right? Because you've got low productivity across the whole system in smallholder farmers. So, how would you enter into this thing? Because the more you can feed the cows better, the more productivity they have, and you feed more people and better healthy, etc. So, what's your perspective on that?
We need the best cow for every different system, and that will almost mean a different cow for every single system, because what works in Arkansas doesn't work in England, what works in sub-Saharan Africa doesn't work in China. And we have seen a tendency in the past to say, here's a high genetic merit let's put a and that'll solve the problem. And of course it won't. So we absolutely need better research, better breeding for cows that can exist on low quality pasture, that can still survive when food is scarce, that can cope with different climates, and increasingly can cope with the threat of climate change in terms of the changes that we're going to see in weather patterns, in cropping, in pasture, and in animal and crop diseases as well. And there's an awful lot of data out there to show that farmers are already seeing the impacts of climate change now. So it's not just going to be in 10 or 20 or 30 years' time. We're seeing those impacts now.
One final question. I mean, you've obviously looked at smallholder farmer systems, and too many, in my observation, have 1 or 2 cows. Is in the long term, meaning 5 to 10 years, do you think that's a sustainable system, or do we need to move to something? I'm not talking about industrial, 10,000 cows or anything, but is there another step, a small step that you would recommend we should look at and recommend to the farmers?
That's a really good question. And obviously for every extra cow, there's an incremental increase in resources, management, etc. I think, and this sounds like a bit of a cop-out answer, it entirely depends on the opportunities to that farmer and the resources that that farmer has available. It'd be very tempting to say, you've earned some extra money, go and buy an extra cow. But if your land, your resources, your management, your feed, your climate don't afford that, then you're going to end up in a worse situation. So while it would be great if every smallholder could do everything a little bit better, could cope with those challenges better, and could take advantages of opportunities, I think we're still going to be in a situation where for some farmers and families, 1 or 2 cows is precisely where their optimum is, even in 10 or 15 years' time.
Yeah. Well, Jude, we've done to our half hour, a little over, which is fine. This is a conversation that could go on for hours, I know. Since we're both passionate about this. But thank you for all the work that you do. Thank you for your activism around this thing. I think that's really important as well. And so thank you for your time, and best of luck, and stay in touch. We will, I'm sure. We're on the same side of what I think is the right side of the debate. So take care, be well, be safe. You too, absolutely. And thank you so much for this opportunity. It's been really fun. As you say, we could talk about this for hours. So I know, I could too. Oh, well, okay. Thanks a lot. Thank you.